Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. Before we ride into today's story, make sure you've subscribed to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the action. Now, pull up a stool, pour yourself a whiskey, and let's get lost in the grit and glory of the Wild West. The silence was a predator. In the months since they had lowered Elias into the hard and forgiving ground, it had stalked the small cabin, devouring the echoes of his laughter, the heavy tread of his boots on the floorboards, the low hum of his voice as he read from the Bible by the firelight. Ilara found herself moving through the two rooms of their home with a quietness that bordered on stealth, as if any sudden noise might startle the memory of him into fading completely. Grief was not a clean wound, it was a swamp, deep and murky, and she was sinking. The official story was a bitter pill she refused to swallow. Marshall Thompson, a man whose gut hung over his gun belt like a sack of damp flour, had ridden out, poked at the blood-soaked mud in the yard with the toe of his boot, and declared it a robbery gone wrong. "Happens all the time, Mum," he'd said, his voice thick with a patronizing sympathy she despised. Vagrants on the trail. Desperate men. But Ilara knew Elias. He was not a man to be taken by surprise, nor was he one to fight over trifles. And the thieves, these desperate men, had been remarkably selective. They had left the two strong horses in the stable, the lockbox of money under the floorboards untouched, and most tellingly, the gold pocket watcher wedding gift to him still nestled in his vest pocket when she'd found him. Its gentle ticking in the pre-dawn stillness had been a sound of profound cruelty, a tiny, metallic heart beating when his had stopped. No, this wasn't a robbery. It was an execution. And the law, in its haste and incompetence, had already closed the book. Her days became a litany of chores, a mindless rhythm of survival that kept the blackest thoughts at bay. Feed the chickens, milk the goat, tend the small garden, mend the fence. Each task was a familiar ghost of a life they had built together. It was during one of these empty, aching afternoons that she found herself drawn to the attic ladder. It was Elias's space, really, a place for his old saddles, tools, and the things a man keeps from a life lived before he was a husband. The air upstairs was thick and still, smelling of sun-baked pine, leather, and the faint, lingering scent of his pipe tobacco. Dust motes danced like tiny sprites in the single beam of light slanting down from the grimy window. Her eyes scanned the clutter, the relics of his past. Tucked away in a dark corner, beneath a moth-eaten cavalry blanket, was a small, locked wooden chest. She had seen it before but had never asked what it held. With a screwdriver from his nearby toolbox, she pried the rusty lock open. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a Colt Point for 5 peacemaker. Its barrel was a deep, blued steel, and its grip was fashioned from smooth, worn walnut. It was heavier than she expected, a solid, dense weight of purpose. This wasn't his working gun, the utilitarian rifle he kept for wolves and the occasional rattlesnake. This was different. This was a gunslinger's weapon, balanced and deadly. She remembered a story he told her once, a rare glimpse into his past, about a time in a dusty border town where a fast draw was the only law that mattered. He'd spun the pistol with a practiced flick of his wrist, a dangerous grace she hadn't understood at the time. He had put it away years ago, declaring that part of his life over. For the first week, the gun was simply an object of mourning. She would take it from its chest in the evenings, the last light of the day bleeding through the cabin window, and just hold it. The cold steel was a conduit to him. She would run her fingers over the smooth wood of the grip, imagining his hand, strong and calloused, wrapped around it. The grief was so immense it felt like a physical presence in the room, and the weight of the gun in her hands was the only thing that felt real, a solid anchor in a sea of loss. But grief is a fire. Left to smolder, it will consume everything. Fanned by rage, it can forge steel. The shift was subtle at first. The sorrow began to recede, leaving behind a hard, crystalline residue of anger. The image of Elias lying in the mud, his eyes open to a sky he could no longer see, was a brand on the inside of her eyelids. The marshal's dismissive words echoed in the oppressive silence. Justice was a fantasy, a story told to children. In this land, the only justice you received was the justice you took for yourself. The Colt ceased to be a memory. It became a question, a possibility, a promise. Her training ground was a secluded hollow a mile from the cabin, where the gurgle of a fast-running creek would muffle the sound of the shots. The first time she cocked the hammer, The sharp, metallic click was like a new heartbeat in the silent woods. She propped a row of old tin cans on a fallen log, their faded labels for beans and peaches a jarring reminder of a mundane world she no longer belonged to. Lifting the gun with both hands, she tried to mimic the stance she'd seen Elias take. The barrel wavered, a wild tremor running up her arms. Her breath hitched. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was a physical blow, a brutal concussion of sound and force that slammed her shoulder and left her ears ringing. The bullet tore a chunk of bark from a tree far to the left of her targets. Smoke, acrid and biting, curled from the barrel. For a moment, she was terrified by the violence she had just unleashed. But the fear was quickly replaced by a cold, thrilling surge of power. It was the first time in a month she had felt anything other than helpless despair. She reloaded, her fingers clumsy and slow, and fired again and again. The first day, she didn't hit a single can. Her shoulder throbbed with a purple bruise, and her ears rang for hours. But she returned the next day, and the day after that. The ritual became the new center of her existence. It was a brutal meditation. The wavering of the barrel lessened as her arms grew stronger. She learned to control her breathing, to exhale slowly as she squeezed the trigger, not pulled it. Then, one afternoon, there was a sharp, satisfying ping. A can of peaches leapt from the log, spinning through the air. A small, ragged hole had appeared in its center. Alara stared at it, her breath held tight in her chest. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. It was proof that the world could still be bent to her will. From that day forward, her progress was relentless. The tremor in her hands vanished, replaced by a surge in steadiness. The row of cans became a graveyard of twisted metal. She learned to shoot with one hand, to draw the weapon from a holster she'd fashioned from old leather, her movements becoming more fluid, more economical. She graduated from cans to pinnacones, then to shooting the heads off dandelions. One evening, as dusk settled, a coyote, drawn by the scent of her chickens, slunk into the clearing near her cabin. In the past, she would have run for Elias's rifle. This time, she didn't even think. The Colt was in her hand as if it had grown there. The draw was a single, fluid motion. The hammer fell, the gun bucked in her hand, and the coyote crumpled into a heap 50 yards away. Standing in the twilight, the smell of gunpowder sharpened the cool air. Alara looked at the still animal, then down at the gun in her hand. It was no longer just a chaos vid and a painful souvenir. It was no longer just a tool for survival. It had become a part of her. The woman who baked bread and tended a garden was buried with her husband. The one who remained was being forged anew, shaped by loss and tempered by the cold, hard logic of the gun. Her secret practice was over. The hunt had begun. The dead coyote was a threshold. Stepping over it, Alara left the last remnants of her old self behind. The act had not brought her satisfaction, not a savage thrill, but a cold, clarifying certainty. She had killed to protect her home, what was left of it, and the ease with which she had done it was a revelation. The gun was no longer just a tool for practice, it was an arbiter of life and death, and she was its hand. This realization did not frighten her, it focused her. The amorphous, all-consuming nature of her grief began to condense, hardening into the single, sharp point of a blade. Her purpose was no longer simply to mourn Elias, but to find the men who had left him in the mud and deliver the only sermon they would understand. Her training regimen evolved. The Creek Hollow was no longer enough. The world was now her practice range. She became a student of the wilderness, her senses honed to a razor's edge. She learned to read the land, to see the story in a broken twig or a displaced stone. She hunted not for sport, but for sustenance and for skill. Her life pared down to a Spartan existence. Each deer she brought down with a clean shot through the heart was a lesson in anatomy, and the quickest way to end a life. Each rabbit she felled on the run was a lesson in leading a moving target. Her hands, once soft from kneading dough and tending gardens, became calloused and sure. They could break down a firearm, clean it, and reassemble it in the dark. They could reload the Colt Peacemaker with the fluid, economical motions of a seasoned gambler dealing cards. The first true test came with the autumn thaw. To men, grizzled prospectors with greed-glinting eyes decided the creek on her property was a prime spot to pan for gold. They saw the lone cabin, the lack of a man's presence, and assumed the occupant was an easy mark. Ilara confronted them at the property line, Elias's long rifle held loosely in the crook of her arm. "This is private land," she said, her voice even, devoid of the tremors she had expected to feel. The larger of the two men, a brute with a stained beard, spat a stream of tobacco juice near her boot. "Since when does a lone woman own a creek?" he sneered. "This land belongs to whoever's strong enough to hold it. And you, little lady, don't look very strong." His partner chuckled, leaning on his shovel. "Go on back to your sewing, Nam. We ain't gonna hurt ya much." Ilara didn't answer. She simply raised the rifle and fired. The shot was not aimed at them. It was aimed at the handle of the shovel the second man was leaning on. The wood exploded in a shower of splinters, the force of the bullet ripping the tool from his grasp and sending a shockwave up his arms. He yelped, staring at his tingling hands in disbelief. The bearded man's sneer vanished, replaced by a flash of anger. He reached for the pistol tucked into his belt, but he was slow, clumsy, and full of misplaced confidence. Before his fingers could even close on the grip, Ilara had dropped the rifle and drawn the Colt. The motion was a single, seamless blur. The hammer was already cocked, the barrel leveled at the space between his eyes. "The next one," she said, her voice now as cold and hard as the steel in her hand, "won't be aimed at a shovel. Get off my land. Now." They stared at her, at the unwavering barrel, at the utter lack of fear or hesitation in her eyes. They saw not a grieving widow, but something far more dangerous. They scrambled for their equipment and fled, casting terrified glances back over their shoulders. Ilara did not lower the gun until they were gone from sight. She didn't kill them, but she had learned that she could. The knowledge settled deep within her, a cold, heavy stone. Word of the encounter trickled into the nearby town of Redemption. The prospectors, their bravado returning once they were safely surrounded by whiskey and the company of other men, told a wild story of a crazed widow, a witch with a pistol who appeared out of nowhere. The story, as such stories do, began to grow. It merged with other whisper-soft claim jumpers found tied up for the marshal with a note that read "Trespassers" pinned to their chests. Of rowdy cattle hands who tried to corner her on the trail and returned to their camp with their pride and their water canteens shot full of holes. They stopped calling her Ilara. She became a local legend, a cautionary tale. They called her the Widow of Miller's Creek, or sometimes, just the Widow. The name was spoken in hushed tones in the saloons and general stores, a name that carried a weight of tragedy, respect, and a healthy dose of fear. The woman who had been defined by her loss was now being defined by her lethality. And in the solitude of her cabin, polishing the walnut grip of her husband's gun, Ilara knew that her true name was Vengeance. She was just waiting for a face to put to it. The first snows of winter were a promise of a harder, leaner time. The wind carried a new bite, and the mountains that framed the horizon donned their white caps. Ilara was tracking a large buck deep in the timber line, the need for preserved meat for the coming months overriding her usual caution. She was so focused on the trail, on the subtle signs of the animal's passage, that she missed the signs of the men until it was too late. There were 3 of them, their clothes little more than rags, their faces gaunt with the feral hunger of escaped convicts. They came at her from the rocks above, thinking her an easy target. The first man learned his mistake when the Colt appeared in her hand and spat fire, sending him tumbling backward with a choked cry. But the other 2 were smarter. They took cover, using the terrain, and suddenly she was pinned down behind a granite boulder, the sharp crack of their stolen pistols echoing through the silent forest. She was good, but she was outnumbered. Just as a cold knot of dread began to tighten in her stomach, a third sound joined the fray. It was the deep, authoritative boom of a heavy rifle, fired from a ridge overlooking the entire scene. One of the convicts, who had been creeping to her flank, suddenly stiffened and fell face first into the snow, a dark stain spreading between his shoulder blades. His partner, startled and confused, spun around to face the new threat. The rifle boomed again, its report rolling down the mountainside like a peal of thunder. The second man crumpled without a sound. Silence returned, absolute and profound, broken only by the sigh of the wind through the pines. Slowly, Ilara rose from behind her cover, the Colt still held at the ready. A figure on horseback was making his way down the steep incline, his movements unhurried and confident. As he drew closer, she saw he was a tall man, broad-shouldered, dressed in practical, worn leather. His face was weathered, all sharp angles and sun-cured lines, and a pair of startlingly pale blue eyes regarded her from beneath the brim of a dusty hat. He dismounted, his rifle held loosely in one hand. "Looks like you had some trouble," he said. His voice was a low baritone, calm and steady. "Nothing I couldn't handle," Alara replied, her tone defensive, not yet lowering her pistol. The man gave a slight nod toward the convict she had shot. "I can see that. But 2-1 are poor odds for anyone." He didn't offer his name, and he didn't ask for hers. He simply walked over to the buck she had been tracking, which had been startled by the gunfire but hadn't run far. With a single, expert shot from his rifle, he brought the animal down. "Still good meat," was all he said. He helped her field dress the buck, his movements efficient and practiced. He worked in a comfortable silence that she found herself not wanting to break. That night, he shared his campfire and his coffee, which was strong and black. He introduced himself, after a long while, simply as Cain. He spoke little, but he listened with an unnerving intensity, his pale eyes seeming to see the grief and rage warring within her. When he left the next morning, he tipped his hat and said, "Stay safe on the trail. It's a hard country for folks on their own." She thought that would be the last she saw of him, but his appearances became a recurring, almost fateful pattern. A few weeks later, when a lecherous fur trapper backed her into a corner at a remote trading post, Cain was suddenly just there, leaning against a support beam, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. He said nothing, but his cold, steady gaze was enough to make the trapper mumble an apology and beat a hasty retreat. Another time, after a blizzard had trapped her in the cabin for a week, she found a freshly killed doe left on her porch, along with 2 boxes of .45 cartridges. There was no note. None was needed. He became her phantom guardian. He never offered platitudes or sympathy. He never pried into the reasons for the haunted look in her eyes or the gun she always wore. He simply seemed to understand. He spoke the same language of silence and survival that she now lived by. In his presence, she felt a sliver of the security she had thought lost forever with Elias. A fragile trust, as delicate as a spider's web in the morning frost, began to form between them. He was a stone wall at her back in a world where she had expected to face every threat alone. In the desolation of her quest, this quiet, deadly man was starting to feel like a savior. Trust, once it takes root in the barren soil of solitude, is a precious thing. Alara had begun to allow herself to trust Cain. He was a quiet presence, a bulwark in the storm of her life. He never demanded, never judged. They could hunt together for an entire day, exchanging only a few clipped words about the direction of the wind or the age of a track. Yet the understanding that flowed between them was deeper than any conversation. He seemed to see the woman she had been, buried beneath the layers of calloused resolve and vengeance, and he respected them both. The first seed of doubt was sown on a sun-bleached afternoon, amid the crack of gunfire and the acrid smell of burnt powder. A posse of bounty hunters, mistaking her for a wanted fugitive with the same color hair, had cornered them in a red rock canyon. The fight was fast and brutal. Alara held her ground behind a boulder, her shots deliberate, while Cain moved with a terrifying calm, his revolver an extension of his will. It was then that she saw it. As Cain fanned the hammer of his pistol for a rapid succession of shots, he didn't use his thumb in the conventional way. Instead, he used a fluid, 2-fingered flick, his index and middle fingers sweeping back to cock the hammer. It was a gunslinger's flourish, a practiced habit born of a need for speed. And it was Elias's habit. The memory struck her with the force of a physical blow. A warm summer evening on the porch, Elias showing it to her, laughing as he called it his old, bad habit from a life he claimed to have long since left behind. To see that exact motion, so unique and personal, replicated by another man sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the desert air. She pushed it away, branding it a coincidence, a trick of the mind dredging up phantoms in the heat of a fight. But the seed was planted. Weeks later, the seed was watered. They were sharing a small fire under a vast, star-dusted sky. The night was quiet, the mood peaceful. As Cain reached for the coffee pot, the worn cuff of his shirt slid up his forearm. In the flickering firelight, a pale, jagged scar was starkly visible on the inside of his wrist. Alara froze, the tin cup halfway to her lips. It was a distinctive, ugly mark, shaped vaguely like a crooked serpent. She had dressed that wound herself 100 times. Not on him, but on Elias. It was a scar from his boyhood, a reckless misadventure with a hot branding iron. He had been embarrassed by it, but she had always traced it with her finger, seeing it as a part of the man she loved. Now, to see its identical twin on the arm of the man sitting across the fire from her was an impossibility. Her heart began to beat a frantic, trapped rhythm against her ribs. Coincidence was a fool's comfort. The world tilted on its axis, the stars seeming to spin. The final, damning piece fell into place not through a physical sign, but a flicker of the soul. They were talking, a rare occurrence, about the kind of men who stalked the territories. Ilara found herself speaking of the night Elias was killed, a thing she had never done with anyone. I only saw the leader's eyes clearly, she murmured, her voice distant, staring into the flames. They were empty. There was nothing in them. No anger, no greed. Just a flat, cold nothing. As she spoke, she glanced up at Cain. And for a sliver of a second, as his gaze met hers across the fire, she saw it. The mask of quiet camaraderie fell away, and she was looking into that same chilling abyss. It was the absolute absence of light, the predator's gaze that sees not a person, but an obstacle to be removed. The expression was there and gone in a blink, replaced by his usual unreadable calm, but she had seen it. The truth crashed down on her with the weight of a collapsing mountain. Her savior was her husband's killer. Every act of kindness, every shared meal, every silent vigil was instantly poisoned. His protection was a lie, his companionship a grotesque charade. He hadn't been guarding her, he had been observing her, perhaps even toying with her. The trust she had so carefully nurtured withered and died, turning to ash in her mouth. The grief she had channeled into rage now had a face, and it was the face of the one man she had let into her world. She chose the place with a grim sense of poetry, the ghost town of redemption, its skeletal buildings groaning under a merciless sun. It was a place where hopes had come to die, a graveyard of ambition. She sent word through a traveling tinker, a simple message of redemption. Noon, she knew he would come. There was an unspoken debt between them, and it was time to collect. When he rode down the town's deserted main street, the dust devils dancing around his horse's hooves, she was already there. She stood in the oppressive heat, not in the shadows, but out in the open, directly in the long, dark shadow of the town's gallows. The cold peacemaker was not in its holster. It was in her hand, held steady, aimed directly at the center of his chest. Cain reined in his horse a good 20 yards away. He looked at her, at the gun, and his craggy face showed no surprise, only a deep, profound weariness, as if he had been expecting this moment his entire life. He swung down from the saddle slowly, his hands held away from his own pistol. "Ilara," he said, his voice the gravelly sound of rocks grinding together. "Don't," she commanded, her own voice a low, dangerous whisper. "Don't you say my name." The gun in her hand was as steady as the granite mountains behind them. All this time, riding with me, watching me. Was it some kind of sick game? It was no game, he answered, his pale eyes fixed on hers. "I saw you," she pressed, her voice cracking with the strain of holding her rage in check. "That night, I saw your eyes." She took a half step forward. "And I've seen them since. The flick of your wrist when you draw. The scar on your arm. Did you think I was a fool? Did you think I wouldn't remember the man you took from me?" Cain didn't flinch, didn't deny. He simply stood there, a statue of dust and regret, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Yes," he said, the single word cutting through the air, confirming her entire nightmare. "It was me." The confession, so plainly offered, was a gut punch. It stole the air from her lungs. This was it. The moment she had lived for, bled for months. The end of her hunt. She thumbed back the hammer of the Colt. The sharp, metallic click was the loudest sound in the world, a period at the end of a sentence of death. Why, she breathed, the question filled with a universe of pain. "It's complicated," he said, taking a small step forward. "Stay right there," she warned, the barrel of the peacemaker not wavering an inch. "Nothing about putting a bullet in an unarmed man is complicated." "He wasn't unarmed," Cain said quietly, his voice laced with a meaning she couldn't grasp. "And he wasn't the man you thought he was, Ilara. The life he had with you, it was built on a lie. What happened between him and me was a reckoning. It was a debt that stretched back 20 years, long before he ever met you." The air grew thick, shimmering with heat and unspoken history. His words were a tangled knot, a justification that felt like another betrayal. The wind picked up, whispering through the empty windows of the dead town like ghosts. It whipped a strand of hair across her face and whistled over the barrel of the gun. Here they stood, the widow and the killer, the hunter and the prey, locked in a tableau of vengeance under the shadow of the gallows. Everything in her world had been reduced to the space between her finger and the trigger. The word hung in the dead air between them, reckoning. It was not the word of a common murderer or a desperate thief. It was a word heavy with history, with a past that stretched back into the shadows, long before Laura was ever a part of it. It struck her with more force than a bullet, shattering the black and white certainty that had been her armor for months. Her entire quest, the righteous fury that had fueled every pre-dawn practice session and every cold night on the trail, was built on a simple, solid foundation. Elias, her good and gentle husband, had been murdered without cause. Cain's words were a pickaxe to that foundation. He wasn't the man you thought he was. A lie. A dead liar, she hissed. But the word lacked the conviction it should have had. Her finger tightened on the trigger, the last ounce of pressure needed to unleash the explosion that would end it all. This was the moment. The face from her nightmares was here, in her sights. Justice was a heartbeat away. Ask yourself, Laura, Cain said, his voice remaining impossibly calm, never taking his eyes off hers. Why does a simple homesteader have a gunslinger's draw? Where did he get that scar? Why did he keep that gummy gun hidden away in your attic? My gun. The words hit her again. She looked down at the cold peacemaker in her hand. Elias had told her it was a relic from his youth, a souvenir. But as Cain spoke, 100 small, forgotten details clicked into place. The way Elias would sometimes fall silent, his eyes distant and haunted, his reluctance to ever speak of his life before they met, his unnatural skill with a weapon he claimed to despise. They were tiny cracks in the facade of the man she loved, cracks she had never wanted to see. We rode together, Cain continued, his voice low and even, a confession delivered like a verdict. With the San Saba crew, we took the Blackwater payroll, him and I. It was supposed to be our last job, enough to start new lives. But he had other plans. He took the whole score, shot our partners in the back, and left me for dead in a dry riverbed. The life he built with you, the land, the horses, it was all bought with blood money. My blood. His friend's blood. Every word was a twisting knife. The image of Elias, her Elias, reading by the fire, his hand gentle on her arm, warred with the image Cain was painting, a ruthless outlaw, a betrayer, a killer. She wanted to scream, to call him a liar, to pull the trigger and silence the poison he was pouring into her memory. But she couldn't, because in the deepest, most honest part of her soul, it made a terrible kind of sense. The man who taught her how to survive with this gun must have been a survivor himself. The rage that had been a cleansing fire was now a confusing, smoky blaze. To kill Cain now. What would that be? Justice for Elias? Or would it be completing the job her husband started, silencing the last witness to his lie? If she pulled that trigger, she would become a killer, just like them, her hands stained by a past that wasn't even her own. She would be an accomplice to a ghost. Slowly, deliberately, with a tremor that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with the sheer force of will it required, she lowered the gun. Her arm felt impossibly heavy, as if the Colt held the weight of two men's lives, not just one. With her thumb, she eased the hammer back down, the soft snick a sound of finality more profound than any gunshot. Killing you would be too easy, she said, her voice hollowed out, empty of the fire that had defined her. It would mean nothing. It would just be the end of a story I don't even understand. She looked at him, truly looked at him, not as a target, but as a minor relic of a violent past that had entangled and destroyed her own. There was no victory in his eyes, no relief. Only the vast, empty landscape of a life spent looking over his shoulder. Without another word, Laura turned her back on him. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. Every instinct screamed at her to finish it, but a newer, stronger instinct told her that true justice was not about ending a life, but about finding a truth. She walked to her horse, her boots kicking up puffs of indifferent dust. She did not ride away immediately. She swung into the saddle and looked back one last time at the man who was both her husband's killer and the only link to his real past. Kane hadn't moved. He stood alone in the shadow of the gallows, a ghost in a town of ghosts. As she rode out of redemption, the cold peacemaker was still in her hand. Its weight felt different now. It was no longer an instrument of vengeance, a tool to settle a score. It was a key. Her husband was a stranger to her, and his story was a lie. Her path was no longer a straight line toward a single grave. It was a winding and certain trail leading back into the past, into the heart of the lie Elias had built. She was no longer just a widow seeking revenge. She was a woman in search of the truth, and she would not stop until she found it, no matter how dark the trail became. Riding away from redemption was like waking from a long, violent dream. The world, which for months had been a stark landscape of black and white, good and evil, was now a confusing panorama of gray. The rage that had been her fuel was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching void. Every landmark on the trail back to her homestead, a twisted juniper tree, a distinctive rock formation, was a monument to a life that had been a lie. The cabin, when she reached it, was no longer a sanctuary of grief but the scene of a crime, a stage set for a long-running deception. Looking at the rocking chair Elias had built, the mantelpiece he had carved, she felt a profound and chilling sense of dislocation. She had loved the ghost, a character crafted with stolen money and a stolen name. She did not stay long. There was nothing for her there but memories, and every memory was now tainted. She packed light, dried meat, petrol, ammunition, and the small tin box where she kept her meager savings. Everything else of handmade quilts, the wedding china, the worn biblesh left behind. Before she walked out the door for the last time, she took the cold peacemaker from its holster and looked at it in the fading light. "My gun," Kane had said. It was the only truth she had left. Her destination was a place she had only heard of in whispers, a town called Jericho. Unlike the small, struggling settlements nearby, Jericho was a hub, a dusty crossroads where cattle trails and rail lines converged. It was a place where people went to disappear, and where information was a commodity, traded in smoky backrooms and over whiskey-stained tables. If the San Saba crew and the Blackwater payroll were more than just words, the memory of them would live in a place like Jericho. Arriving in Jericho was a shock to the senses. The main street was a river of noise and humanity, cowboys fresh off the trail, grim-faced prospectors, elegantly dressed gamblers, and hard-eyed men whose only business was survival. Alara, astride her horse, felt small and exposed. But the woman who had faced down her husband's killer was not the woman who had arrived at Miller's Creek years ago. She kept her expression neutral, her gaze sweeping the street, assessing threats, her hand never far from the Colt on her hip. Her first stop was the largest saloon, the Gilded Cage. Inside, the piano played a tinny, cheerful tune that did nothing to disguise the tension in the room. She took a seat at a small, secluded table, ordering a beer she had no intention of drinking. For hours, she simply watched and listened. She learned the hierarchy of the room, who held power and who paid tribute. Finally, she approached the bartender, a hulking man with a scarred face and weary eyes. She pushed a coin across the bar. "I'm looking for information," she said, her voice low. "About an old outfit. The San Saba crew." The bartender's eyes narrowed. He took the coin and wiped the bar, his movements slow and deliberate. "Some stories are best left buried," he said, his voice a low growl. "Digging 'em up tends to get folks planted." "I'm not looking for trouble," Alara replied, her gaze steady. "I'm looking for history." He stared at her for a long moment, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the back of the room. An old man sat alone in a corner, nursing a glass of rye, his clothes threadbare but his eyes sharp and intelligent. "Silas Croft," the bartender muttered. "Used to write for the Territorial Times. He remembers everything. Whether he'll tell you, that's your problem." Alara picked up her untouched beer and walked toward the corner table. The next chapter of the story, she knew, was sitting right in front of her. Silas Croft looked up as Alara approached, his eyes, clouded with age but still sharp, taking in every detail of her apprehensive worn homestead clothes, the calloused hands, and the unmistakable weight of the Colt .45 riding on her hip. He had the look of a man who had seen 1,000 stories walk through 1,000 saloon doors and had learned to read the first page in a single glance. "The old-timer's corner is a lonely place, ma'am," he said, his voice raspy with disuse and cheap whiskey. Most folks come here to forget the past, not dig it up. The bartender said you remember everything, Alara stated, placing her beer on the table. She sat down without waiting for an invitation. Remembering's the easy part. It's the talking that costs, Silas replied, taking a slow sip of his rye. Alara pushed a few more coins across the table. I want to know about the San Saba crew. Silas looked at the coins, then back at her. That's a name I haven't heard spoken out loud in 20 years. They were ghosts. Vicious ones. Why on earth would a woman like you be chasing ghosts? Instead of answering directly, Alara unbuckled her gun belt and laid it carefully on the table, the walnut grip of the peacemaker facing him. Does this look familiar? The old man leaned forward, his eyes squinting. He reached out a trembling hand and traced a small, almost invisible marking carved into the wood just below the trigger guard, a tiny, stylized serpent eating its own tail. His breath caught in his throat. I'll be damned, he whispered, sitting back heavily in his chair. The deacon's serpent. I only ever saw it once, on a wanted poster. He looked at Alara with a new and tense curiosity. Where did you get this? It belonged to my husband, she said, the words tasting like ash. Elias Thorne. Silas shook his head slowly. Never heard the name. But the leader of the San Saba crew. The man who carried this gun. His name wasn't Thorne. They called him the deacon, because he could quote scripture while slitting a man's throat. His real name was Elias Kane. He began to talk, the words spilling out as if a dam had broken. He told her of the San Saba crew's reign of terror, a string of brutal robberies culminating in the legendary Blackwater payroll heist. They were smart, organized, and led by a man who was equal parts charm and savagery. Silas then told her of the betrayal, how the crew was ambushed and wiped out after the heist, with only the deacon and the payroll vanishing without a trace. Most folks figured the deacon died somewhere out in the desert, Silas said, his voice low. But there was a rumor. One other survivor. The deacon's younger brother, a mean, bitter son of a bitch named Jebediah. He was the only one who wasn't at the final shootout. Some say the deacon set him up to take the fall. Alara felt a wave of nausea. Elias Kane. Deacon Kane. Her husband. Silas reached into a worn satchel and pulled out a tattered leather-bound folio. He flipped through several pages yellowed with age until he found what he was looking for, a faded, crudely drawn wanted poster. He pushed it across the table. The drawing was rough, but the eyes, the set of the jaw, the high cheekbones. It was unmistakably Elias. Younger, harder, a predator's gaze where she had only known a husband's smile. And beneath the sketch were the words, wanted, Elias Deacon Kane. $5,000. The lie was complete. Not only had he stolen money, he had stolen his brother's name, Elias Thorne. He had taken his betrayed brother's surname, twisting it into the foundation of his new, peaceful life. Her husband wasn't just a thief, he was a fratricide in spirit, if not in fact, a man who had erased his own family to invent himself anew. And somewhere out there, his brother Jebediah was either dead, in prison, or still searching. The revelation of Jebediah Thorne's existence changed the nature of Alara's quest. This was no longer just about uncovering a dead man's lies, it was about a living threat, a loose thread from Elias's past that could unravel her own future. If Jebediah was alive, he would surely still be looking for the brother who betrayed him and the money that disappeared. And now, Alara was the one living on the deacon's land, carrying the deacon's gun. To Jebediah, she wouldn't be a grieving widow, she would be a clue, or a target. She left Jericho at dawn, the wanted poster tucked safely in her saddlebag. Her path was no longer clear. She felt hunted, caught in the middle of a blood feud she had never known existed. As she rode through a narrow, rocky pass a few miles out of town, instinct screamed at her. She reined in her horse just as two rifle shots cracked from the canyon rim, kicking up dust where she would have been. She dove from the saddle, rolling behind a cluster of boulders as more shots rang out. Two men were working their way down the rocks, their movements sloppy but determined. They weren't trying to kill her, she realized. They were trying to pin her down. Just tell us where the deacon hid the gold, lady, one of them shouted. Jebediah will pay you for your trouble, or he'll pay us for your scalp. Your choice. So, it had begun. She drew the cold steel of familiar comfort, and prepared to fight. But before she could fire, a single, deep rifle shot echoed from the other side of the pass. One of the ambushers cried out and tumbled down the rocks. His partner, panicked, turned and fired wildly in the direction of the shot, only to be met by a second, precise rifle blast that silenced him permanently. Laura stayed behind her cover, her heart pounding, as a lone rider emerged from the shadows of the canyon. It was Kane. He dismounted and walked toward her, his expression grim. "I figured he'd find you sooner or later," Kane said, reloading his rifle with methodical calm. "You?" Laura breathed, a fresh wave of anger and confusion washing over her. "You're following me." "I'm following him," Kane corrected. "Jebediah. After I dealt with your husband, I knew his brother would be the last piece of the puzzle. I've been tracking him for weeks. He's been gathering a crew, telling everyone the deacon's widow knows where the Blackwater payroll is hidden." He stood before her, the man who had shattered her world, now appearing once again as her protector. The irony was a bitter pill. "Why?" she demanded. "Why should you care?" "Because the story isn't finished," Kane said, his pale eyes holding hers. "Elias Kane destroyed my life. His brother Jebediah is the last piece of that wreckage. He's a poison, and he thinks you're the map to a fortune. He will not stop until he has it, or you're dead." He paused, the silence stretching between them. "Whether we like it or not, Elara, our trails lead to the same place. We have to face him. Together." It was an impossible choice. To stand with the man who killed her husband against the brother her husband betrayed. It was a devil's bargain, a twisted alliance forged in the ashes of a lie. But looking at the two dead men on the rocks, she knew Kane was right. She could not face this new threat alone. She was no longer just a hunter, she was the hunted. "Where do we find him?" she asked, her voice hard as nails. Kane nodded toward the distant, jagged peaks. "There's an old silver mine in those hills. The San Saba crew used it as a hideout. If there's a place the deacon would have buried his sins, it would be there." The journey to the abandoned Oro Grande mine was a silent, tense affair. Elara and Kane rode side by side, two ghosts drawn together by a shared history of violence and betrayal. The trust between them was non-existent, replaced by a fragile, pragmatic understanding. Survival depended on cooperation. They found the mine entrance hidden in a narrow ravine, a dark, gaping mouth in the mountainside. The air spilling from it was cold and smelled of damp earth and forgotten time. Jebediah's trail led directly inside. "He knows we're coming," Kane said quietly, checking his revolver. "This is his ground." They entered the oppressive darkness, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows on the tunnel walls. The mine was a labyrinth of rotting timbers and treacherous drops. Every sound a dripping rock, the scuttling of a rat was amplified, stretching their nerves taut. They found him in a large, central cavern, beside a collapsed tunnel. Jebediah Thorne was a twisted reflection of his brother, had the same sharp features, but they were contorted by a lifetime of bitterness and rage. He was not alone. Two of his men stood with him, rifles raised. In the center of the cavern sat three rotting leather satchels, their sides split, spilling the dull gleam of gold coins onto the dusty floor. "Brother Kane," Jebediah sneered, his eyes wild in the lantern light. "Come to collect your share." "And you," he spat, his gaze falling on Elara, the deacon's whore, "come to claim your inheritance." "He told you where it was, didn't he? Before you put him in the ground." "He didn't have to," Elara said, her voice echoing in the cavern. "Some secrets have a way of digging themselves up." The standoff shattered into a chaotic explosion of gunfire. Lanterns were shot out, plunging the cavern into a disorienting mix of flashing muzzles and absolute darkness. Kane moved with deadly purpose, a shadow among shadows. Elara took cover, her shots aimed and precise, the Colt bucking in her hand. It was a fight born of a 20-year-old betrayal, and she was at its heart. In the end, it came down to the three of them. Jebediah, wounded, made a desperate lunge for Elara. She sidestepped him, bringing the heavy barrel of the Colt down on his shoulder, sending him sprawling. He lay on the ground, disarmed and defeated, his face a mask of agony and hate. She stood over him, the gun leveled at his head, the same choice she had faced with Kane laid before her again. But this time, there was no confusion. Killing him would be an act of cleaning up her husband's mess, another death in a long line of them. It was not justice. She lowered the gun. With the fight over, the silence that descended was broken only by their ragged breaths. The gold lay between them, a cursed treasure gleaming faintly in the one remaining lantern's light. It was a fortune that had destroyed a dozen men, including the man she had married. Cain looked from the gold to Alara. "It was never about the money," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the years. "It was about the lie." He kicked one of the bags, the coins scattering with a hollow clatter. "It's poison." Alara nodded. Taking it would mean letting Elias's crimes become her own. Together, they worked to drag the last of Jebediah's explosives to the cavern's entrance. They left him tied up for the law to find, with a single gold coin placed in his pocket. A final, bitter irony. As they rode away, the blast from the mine sealed the entrance, burying the blood money, the ghosts of the San Saba crew, and the last remnants of Elias Cain's dark legacy forever. At the crest of the ridge, as the first light of dawn painted the sky, they stopped. Their paths, which had been so violently intertwined, had finally reached their end. "What will you do now?" Alara asked. "Ride north," Cain answered, looking toward the horizon. "Find a place where no one knows my name." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not a killer or a savior, but simply a man weary of the ghosts he carried. "And you?" "I don't know," she said, and for the first time, not knowing felt like freedom. The cabin was not her home. The name Thorn was not her own. She was untethered, a blank page. They did not shake hands or say goodbye. They simply gave each other a final, solemn nod of understanding. Cain turned his horse north. Alara turned hers south. She rode alone into the sunrise, the cold peacemaker holstered at her side. It was no longer a tool of vengeance or a key to a dark past. It was just a gun, and she was just a woman. She had not found the simple revenge she once craved, but she had found something far more valuable, a harsh and painful truth that had, in the end, set her free.